there is something moving in the clouds of Venus. We have real images of it, and in those images, the same phenomenon keeps appearing. Patches that form, stretch, fragment, and then reassemble. They move with the winds, but not like ordinary clouds. In some cases, their structure changes in minutes. That shouldn't happen. These features absorb UV light in ways we can't fully explain. Some of them resemble something we already recognize. Not terrain or storms, but behavior. We don't know what's causing it, but the images are clear this is motion. In 1967, two scientists proposed that life might exist in the clouds of Venus. The idea was simple. Venus had probably been habitable once, billions of years ago, when it was cooler and may have had liquid water on its surface. As the planet warmed and the oceans evaporated, any life that existed would have faced extinction. But microorganisms are resilient. They adapt, and some of them might have found refuge in the only place left where conditions were tolerable: the clouds. Carl Sagan and Morowitz weren't claiming that life definitely existed on Venus. They were simply pointing out that it wasn't impossible. The cloud layer had the right temperature. It had liquid droplets. Even if those droplets were made of sulfuric acid, it had access to sunlight for energy, and it had trace amounts of water vapor, CO2, and other chemicals that could, in theory, support metabolism. The paper didn't get much attention at the time. Venus was too alien, too different from Earth. Most scientists assumed that if life existed anywhere in the solar system beyond Earth, it would be on Mars. But the idea didn't go away. It lingered in the background, waiting for new data. Fast forward to 2015. Japan's Akatsuki spacecraft enters orbit around Venus after a 5-year journey through space. Its mission is to study the planet's atmosphere in detail, using cameras that can see in ultraviolet, infrared, and visible light. Akatsuki begins taking pictures, thousands of them, and the ultraviolet images are stunning. The dark patches are everywhere. They stretch across the equator in long, thread-like streaks. They form swirling patterns near the poles. They appear bright in some wavelengths and dark in others, indicating that multiple substances are involved, and they change rapidly. In some images taken just 12 minutes apart, the patches shift noticeably in size, shape, and intensity. This is not what you'd expect from simple chemistry. On Earth, clouds form and dissipate based on temperature, humidity, and air currents. The processes are dynamic, but they follow predictable patterns. Rain clouds don't suddenly appear and disappear in minutes. Fog doesn't develop into complex shapes without a clear physical cause. But on Venus, the dark patches behave differently. They evolve on timescales ranging from minutes to months. They move with the atmospheric winds, but they also seem to have internal structure, as if something is organizing them from within. Scientists began to wonder, what if these aren't just clouds? What if they're blooms? On Earth, when conditions are right, microorganisms can multiply rapidly in water. Phytoplankton blooms in the ocean can cover thousands of square kilometers. Could something similar be happening in the clouds of Venus? The chemistry of Venus's atmosphere presents a puzzle. We know that the clouds are made primarily of sulfuric acid. The concentration varies with altitude, but in the habitable zone, between 48 and 60 kilometers, the droplets contain roughly 75 to 98% sulfuric acid, with the rest being water. This is an extremely hostile environment. Sulfuric acid is corrosive. It dissolves organic molecules. It breaks down proteins and nucleic acids. For decades, scientists assumed that no life could survive in such conditions. But then researchers started testing this assumption in the lab. In 2023, a team led by Sarah Seeger at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology conducted experiments with nucleic acid bases, the building blocks of DNA and RNA. They exposed these molecules to concentrated sulfuric acid, expecting them to degrade rapidly. They didn't. The nucleic acid bases remained stable. They didn't dissolve. They persisted in the acid for days, even weeks, without significant degradation. This was a revelation. If the fundamental molecules of life could survive in sulfuric acid, then maybe the environment in Venus's clouds wasn't as inhospitable as previously thought. Maybe life had found a way to adapt. Other experiments followed. Researchers tested amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. They tested lipids, the molecules that form cell membranes. They tested peptide nucleic acids, synthetic molecules that resemble DNA but are more chemically stable. Many of these molecules survived. The results didn't prove that life exists on Venus, but they removed one of the main arguments against it. The chemistry was no longer a deal breaker. One of the biggest challenges for life in Venus's clouds is water. Life as we know it requires water. Every organism on Earth, from bacteria to blue whales, depends on liquid water to function. Proteins fold correctly only in aqueous environments. DNA replicates using water as a solvent. Metabolic reactions proceed through water-based chemistry, and Venus's atmosphere is dry, very dry. Water vapor makes up only about 30 parts per million of the atmosphere on average. In some regions, it can reach a few hundred parts per million. But even at its highest concentrations, the amount of water available is far less than what most terrestrial organisms need. So how could life survive? The answer might lie in the cloud droplets themselves. Sulfuric acid is hygroscopic. It absorbs water from its surroundings. Even in a very dry atmosphere, a droplet of concentrated sulfuric acid will pull in whatever moisture is available. This means that the cloud particles on Venus, despite being mostly acid, also contain small amounts of liquid water. How much water? That depends on the concentration of the acid and the temperature. Researchers have calculated that in the lower cloud layer, where the temperature is around 60 degrees Celsius, the droplets could contain up to 25% water by mass. That's not a lot, but it might be enough. There's another possibility. Some scientists have suggested that the cloud particles aren't pure sulfuric acid. They might contain other substances, salts, metal sulfates, organic compounds. These additives could change the properties of the droplets, making them less acidic and more hospitable to life. Observations from the Venera missions in the 1980s detected iron and magnesium in the clouds. More recent analyses have suggested the presence of hydrated iron sulfate and magnesium sulfate. These salts could lower the acidity of the droplets, bringing the pH closer to levels that some extremophile bacteria on Earth can tolerate. Again, this doesn't prove anything, but it opens the door. Life needs energy. On Earth, most life gets its energy from the sunday. Plants and algae use photosynthesis to convert sunlight into chemical energy. Other organisms eat the plants, or eat the organisms that eat the plants, creating a food chain that ultimately depends on solar radiation. Venus receives plenty of sunlight. In fact, it receives more solar energy per square meter than Earth does because it's closer to the sunday. But most of that energy never reaches the surface. The thick clouds reflect about 75% of the incoming light back into space. The rest is absorbed in the atmosphere, and much of it is absorbed in the ultraviolet range, exactly where those mysterious dark patches appear. This raises an intriguing possibility. What if the dark patches are photosynthetic organisms? On Earth, photosynthetic pigments like chlorophyll absorb specific wavelengths of light. Chlorophyll, A, absorbs strongly in the blue and red parts of the spectrum, which is why plants look green. Other pigments, like carotenoids, absorb different wavelengths and give algae and bacteria their characteristic colors. Could similar pigments exist on Venus? Researchers have compared the absorption spectrum of Venus's clouds to the spectra of various terrestrial organisms. Some bacteria, particularly acidophilic species that thrive in extreme environments, show absorption features that closely match the Venusian ultraviolet absorber. Proteins containing iron-sulfur clusters also absorb ultraviolet light in the right range. So do certain organic cofactors like pterins and carotenoids. None of this is conclusive. Absorption spectra alone can't tell us what's causing the dark patches. but the similarities are striking. In September 2020, a team of astronomers made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. They had detected phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus. Phosphine is a simple molecule, one phosphorus atom bonded to 3 hydrogen atoms. On Earth, it's produced mainly by anaerobic bacteria, microorganisms that live in oxygen-free environments like swamps, marshes, and sewage treatment plants. It's also produced industrially, but in nature, it's almost exclusively a signature of biological activity. The researchers didn't claim they had found life. They were careful to emphasize that their detection needed confirmation and that there might be unknown abiotic processes producing the gas. But the implication was clear. Phosphine on Venus was unexpected. And if it was real, it demanded an explanation. The discovery was controversial from the start. Other scientists questioned the data analysis. The signal was faint, buried in noise. The team had used 2 different telescopes, the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope in Hawaii and the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in Chile, and the results from the 2 instruments didn't perfectly agree. Some researchers argued that the feature attributed to phosphine might actually be sulfur dioxide, which has a similar spectral signature. The debate grew heated. Papers were published, rebuttals were written, data were reanalyzed. Some studies supported the detection, others refuted it. By 2023, new observations had been made. The original team confirmed the presence of phosphine using additional telescope time. They also detected ammonia, another molecule that's often associated with biological processes. But the question remained, where was the phosphine coming from? Volcanic activity was one possibility. Venus is geologically active. Recent observations have shown evidence of fresh lava flows on the surface, suggesting that volcanoes are still erupting. Volcanoes can release phosphorus-containing gases, which might react in the atmosphere to form phosphine. But the calculations didn't add up. Volcanic emissions wouldn't produce phosphine in the concentrations observed. The gas should be destroyed quickly by ultraviolet radiation. For it to persist in the atmosphere, there would need to be a continuous source replenishing it at a rate much higher than volcanism could provide. Life was another possibility. If microorganisms in the clouds were producing phosphine as a metabolic byproduct, that could explain the observations. But this raised new questions. What kind of metabolism would produce phosphine? And could such organisms survive in sulfuric acid? The answers are still unknown. While the phosphine debate raged, other scientists were making discoveries of their own. In 2018, researchers analyzing infrared images from Akatsuki noticed something unusual. On the night side of Venus, where the clouds are backlit by the heat radiating from the lower atmosphere, they saw a pattern. Long, narrow streaks extended across both hemispheres, stretching from the poles toward the equator in a nearly symmetrical arrangement. This was the planetary scale streak structure. The streaks weren't visible in ultraviolet or visible light. They only appeared in the infrared images at wavelengths around 2 micrometers, and they corresponded to regions where the cloud opacity was lower, allowing more heat to escape from below. At first, the researchers thought this was a purely meteorological phenomenon. Venus's atmosphere is dominated by strong zonal winds that blow from east to west, circling the planet in just 4 to 6 days at the cloud tops. These winds create waves, eddies, and other dynamic features. The streak structure could simply be a manifestation of those dynamics. But when they ran computer simulations, they found something unexpected. The simulations could reproduce the streak structure, but only under specific conditions. The atmosphere needed to have a layer of low static stability between about 50 and 60 kilometers altitude. This layer, which had been inferred from earlier observations by the Pioneer Venus probes, acts as a boundary where the temperature changes rapidly with altitude. When the simulations included this low stability layer, the streaks appeared. They formed as regions of strong downward airflow, where air from higher altitudes descended into the cloud layer, pushing aside the cloud particles and creating gaps in the opacity. And the streaks persisted. They didn't come and go randomly. They evolved slowly, maintaining their overall structure over periods of days or weeks. The researchers proposed that the streak structure was caused by a combination of atmospheric waves and baroclinic instability, a process where temperature gradients drive large-scale flows, but they also noted that the exact mechanism was still unclear. What makes this relevant to the question of life is the timescale. The streaks change on timescales that match the rotation period of the atmosphere. And if microorganisms are present in the clouds, they would be carried along by these same winds, concentrated in certain regions and diluted in others, creating patterns that evolve in sync with the atmospheric circulation. It's speculative, but it's consistent with the idea that the clouds are not static. They're alive with motion, chemistry, and possibly biology. Understanding how anything could survive in Venus's clouds requires understanding the circulation of the atmosphere. Venus's clouds don't just sit still. They're in constant motion, driven by powerful winds that vary with altitude. At the cloud tops, around 70 kilometers up, the winds blow at speeds exceeding 100 meters per second. That's faster than the most powerful hurricanes on Earth. Lower down, in the middle cloud layer, the winds slow to about 50 meters per second. And near the bottom of the clouds, at 48 kilometers, they slow further still. This creates a complex three-dimensional flow pattern. Air rises near the equator, where solar heating is strongest. It flows poleward at high altitudes, then descends near the poles, creating a circulation cell in each hemisphere. This is called a Hadley cell, similar to the circulation patterns in Earth's tropics. But on Venus, the Hadley cells extend all the way from the equator to the poles, covering the entire planet. Superimposed on this large-scale circulation are smaller eddies, waves, and turbulent motions. Air parcels don't move in straight lines. They spiral, loop, and mix, carrying heat, moisture, and chemical species from one altitude to another. For microorganisms, this creates both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that the clouds are not a stable environment. A microbe floating at 50 kilometers altitude might be carried upward by convection into the cold, dry upper atmosphere where conditions are harsh. Or it might be carried downward into the hot, dense, lower atmosphere where temperatures exceed 100 degrees Celsius and the air is too warm for most biochemistry. But the opportunity is that the circulation provides a mechanism for recycling. Imagine a microorganism that lives in the habitable zone, the sweet spot between 48 and 60 kilometers. It absorbs sunlight, metabolizes sulfur compounds, and reproduces, but eventually it settles downward, pulled by gravity. As it descends, the temperature rises. At some point, it reaches a depth where the heat becomes lethal. The cell dies. But death isn't the end. The organic molecules from the dead cell are broken apart by heat and ultraviolet radiation. Some of those molecules might evaporate, rising back up into the cooler layers. Others might be carried upward by convection. And when they reach the habitable zone again, they become nutrients for new microorganisms. This is a life cycle. Not in the traditional sense of birth, growth, and reproduction, but a cycle nonetheless, where organic matter is continuously recycled between the habitable clouds and the inhospitable layers above and below. Researchers have called this the Venusian biosphere hypothesis. It's not proven, but it's plausible. To understand how life might survive in Venus's clouds, scientists have looked for analogues on Earth. One of the best examples is Aciditheobacillus ferrooxidans, a bacterium that lives in extremely acidic environments. It thrives at pH levels between 1 and 2, comparable to the acidity of battery acid. It gets its energy by oxidizing iron and sulfur compounds, processes that release electrons which the bacterium uses to power its metabolism. This organism can survive in conditions that would kill most other life forms. It can tolerate high concentrations of heavy metals. It can fix carbon dioxide from the air, building organic molecules from scratch. And it can reproduce in environments where water is scarce, as long as there's some moisture present. Another analog is found in the deep-sea hydrothermal vents on Earth's ocean floor. These vents spew superheated water rich in sulfur, iron, and other minerals. The organisms that live near the vents don't rely on sunlight. Instead, they use chemosynthesis, deriving energy from chemical reactions between the vent fluids and seawater. These organisms show that life can exist in places far removed from the surface, in conditions that seem utterly hostile. They demonstrate that biology is flexible, adaptable, and resilient. If life exists on Venus, it probably doesn't look like anything we're familiar with. It might not have DNA as we know it. It might not use the same metabolic pathways, but it would share the same fundamental principles: capturing energy, building structure, and reproducing. One of the most difficult questions about life on Venus is how it could have gotten into the clouds in the first place. If Venus once had liquid water on its surface, as many scientists believe, then life might have originated there, just as it did on Earth. But as the planet warmed and the oceans evaporated, that life would have faced extinction. The surface became too hot, the atmosphere became too thick, and the water disappeared. So, how could organisms transition from the surface to the clouds? One possibility is evaporation. As the oceans boiled away, water vapor would have risen into the atmosphere, carrying with it any microorganisms that were suspended in the water. Some of those microbes might have survived the transition, finding refuge in the water droplets that condensed in the clouds. Another possibility is volcanic activity. Volcanoes on Earth release not just lava and gases, but also particles, dust, ash, and aerosols. On Venus, volcanic eruptions could have launched material high into the atmosphere, including any microorganisms living near the volcanic vents. Some of that material might have reached the habitable zone and remained aloft. A third possibility is that life never originated on the surface at all. It might have been seeded from space, through panspermia. Meteorite impacts on Earth could have ejected rock fragments into space, carrying bacteria or bacterial spores with them. Some of those fragments might have eventually reached Venus, delivering the building blocks of life directly to the atmosphere. All of these scenarios are speculative. We have no direct evidence for any of them, but they illustrate that the path from surface to clouds, or from space to clouds, is not impossible. What do we actually see when we look at Venus? The most compelling evidence for something unusual in the clouds comes from the changing patterns in ultraviolet light. Akatsuki has been observing Venus continuously since 2015. Its ultraviolet camera captures images at two wavelengths, 283 nanometers and 365 nanometers. At 283 nanometers, sulfur dioxide absorbs light, so regions with more sulfur dioxide appear dark. At 365 nanometers, the unknown absorber dominates, and the dark patches indicate where that substance is concentrated. By comparing images taken over days, weeks, and months, researchers have been able to track how the dark patches evolve. They don't move randomly. They follow the atmospheric winds, drifting from east to west with the rotation of the atmosphere. But they also show internal structure. Some patches grow larger, others shrink. Some merge together, others split apart. And the changes happen quickly. In images taken just 12 minutes apart, the shape and intensity of the patches can shift noticeably. This is far faster than what you'd expect from simple chemical diffusion or temperature variations. It suggests that something is actively changing the composition of the clouds. Infrared observations tell a similar story. The nightside images from Akatsuki show variations in cloud opacity that persist for days. The opacity changes indicate that the concentration or size distribution of cloud particles is varying from place to place. And again, these variations don't follow simple patterns. They're complex, dynamic, and unpredictable. One interpretation is that these variations are purely meteorological. The atmosphere is turbulent. Convection, waves, and eddies constantly redistribute heat and material. The patterns we see might just be the result of complex fluid dynamics. But another interpretation is that the cloud particles themselves are changing. If microorganisms are present, they could alter the optical properties of the droplets by absorbing light, releasing gases, or modifying the chemistry of the surrounding acid. The variations we see might be the signature of biological activity. We can't distinguish between these possibilities yet. Not with current data. One of the most intriguing pieces of indirect evidence comes from the periodicity of the ultraviolet contrasts. On Earth, nearly all organisms exhibit a circadian rhythm, a roughly 24-hour cycle that governs their metabolism, growth, and behavior. This rhythm is driven by the rotation of the planet and the day-night cycle of sunlight. Plants open their leaves during the day and close them at night. Animals are active during certain hours and rest during others. Even bacteria show daily fluctuations in gene expression. Could something similar be happening on Venus? Researchers have analyzed thousands of ultraviolet images from Akatsuki, measuring the brightness and contrast of the clouds over time. They performed a statistical analysis to look for periodic variations, patterns that repeat at regular intervals. They found several. The strongest periodicities correspond to the orbital motion of Venus around the Sun, which takes about 225 Earth days, and the solar day on Venus, which takes about 117 Earth days. These are expected. They reflect the changing angle of sunlight as the planet moves through its orbit and rotates on its axis. But there are also shorter periodicities. Peaks appear at around 5 days, 3 days, and 2 days. These match the rotation period of the atmosphere at different altitudes. At the cloud tops, the atmosphere rotates in about 4 to 5 days. Deeper down, in the middle cloud layer, the rotation period is closer to 6 days. And near the bottom of the clouds, it slows to around 7 or 8 days. If microorganisms are floating in the clouds, they would experience a day-night cycle based on the rotation of the atmosphere, not the rotation of the planet. A microbe at 55 kilometers altitude would see sunrise and sunset roughly every 5 to 6 days. And if it has a circadian rhythm, its metabolism might fluctuate in sync with that cycle. The observed periodicities don't prove that life exists on Venus. They could be explained by atmospheric dynamics alone, but they're consistent with the hypothesis. We won't know if life exists on Venus until we go there and look. And that's exactly what's about to happen. Several missions are now in development, designed to return to Venus and probe its atmosphere in unprecedented detail. NASA is planning 2 missions, Da Vinci and Veritas. The European Space Agency is preparing Envision, and private companies are entering the field as well. The Da Vinci mission, scheduled to launch in the early 2030s, will deploy a descent probe into the Venusian atmosphere. The probe will fall for about an hour, sampling the air at different altitudes and analyzing its chemical composition. It carries a mass spectrometer capable of detecting a wide range of molecules, including organic compounds, phosphine, ammonia, and noble gases. Da Vinci won't search for life directly. Its goal is to understand the chemistry and structure of the atmosphere. But if microorganisms are present, the instruments might detect their chemical signatures. Veritas and Envision are orbital missions. They won't enter the atmosphere, but they will map the surface with high-resolution radar and study the clouds from above. Veritas will look for signs of active volcanism, which could provide clues about the source of gases like sulfur dioxide and phosphine. Envision will carry spectrometers to measure the composition of the upper atmosphere and track how it changes over time. The most ambitious mission is the privately funded Venus Life Finder. This mission, led by Sarah Seeger and her team at MIT, is specifically designed to search for signs of life in the clouds. The first mission, set to launch in 2026, will carry a small probe equipped with an autofluorescence nephelometer. This instrument shines a laser into the cloud droplets and measures how they scatter light. If organic molecules are present, they will fluoresce, emitting light at specific wavelengths. The probe will spend only a few minutes in the cloud layer before it falls to the surface and is destroyed by the heat. But those few minutes might be enough to detect the signature of life. If the first mission succeeds, follow-up missions are planned. These would carry more advanced instruments, capable of identifying specific molecules and even imaging individual particles. Eventually, the goal is to return a sample of Venusian cloud material to Earth for detailed analysis. That won't happen anytime soon. Sample return from Venus is extraordinarily difficult, but it's not impossible. Before we conclude that life exists on Venus, we need to rule out every other explanation. Science doesn't work by proving things, it works by disproving them. We propose hypotheses, test them against observations, and eliminate the ones that don't fit. What remains, after all the alternatives have been ruled out, is the best explanation we have. So what are the alternative explanations for the observations? For the ultraviolet absorber, one possibility is that it's an unknown photochemical product. Ultraviolet light from the sun can break apart molecules in the atmosphere, creating reactive species that combine in unexpected ways. Some of these products might absorb ultraviolet light, producing the dark patches we see. Another possibility is that the absorber is a form of sulfur. Elemental sulfur exists in multiple allotropes, some of which are highly absorptive in the ultraviolet range. These could form in the clouds through reactions between sulfur dioxide and other sulfur-bearing gases. For the phosphine detection, volcanic activity remains a plausible source. Even if current models suggest that volcanoes can't produce enough phosphine, our understanding of Venusian volcanism is incomplete. There might be processes we haven't accounted for. For the streak structure and the changing cloud patterns, atmospheric dynamics provide a natural explanation. Venus's atmosphere is one of the most complex and least understood in the solar system. The interactions between solar heating, infrared cooling, and the planet's slow rotation create flows and instabilities that we're only beginning to model accurately. None of these explanations can be ruled out yet. They might all be correct. The dark patches might be purely chemical, the phosphine might be volcanic, the streak structure might be entirely meteorological. But here's the thing, none of these explanations fully account for all the observations. The ultraviolet absorber doesn't match the spectrum of any known inorganic compound. Sulfur comes close, but not close enough. Photochemical models predict certain products, but those products have different properties than what we see. The phosphine detection remains controversial, but it's been confirmed by multiple independent observations. If it's real, no abiotic process proposed so far can explain it. And the rapid changes in the cloud patterns, the periodicities, the complex structures, all of these suggest that something more than simple physics is at work. That doesn't mean it's life, but it means we don't understand what's happening in Venus's clouds. Carl Sagan famously said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." The claim that life exists on Venus is extraordinary. It would fundamentally change our understanding of biology, planetary science, and the potential for life elsewhere in the universe. It would mean that life can arise not just on planetary surfaces, but in atmospheres. It would mean that sulfuric acid is not a barrier to biology, but a medium for it. And it would mean that our solar system hosts at least two independent origins of life, or possibly just one origin with transfer between planets. Any of these implications would be profound. So the burden of proof is high. We can't claim life on Venus based on indirect observations, unexplained chemistry, and suggestive patterns. We need direct evidence. We need to detect organic molecules in the clouds. We need to measure their isotopic ratios to determine if they're biological or abiotic. We need to image the cloud particles and see if they have structures consistent with cells or spores. And ideally, we need to bring samples back to Earth and study them in the lab. That's the standard we're aiming for. But here's the other side of the equation. We also can't dismiss the possibility of life just because it seems unlikely. Science has been wrong before. We've assumed that certain environments were uninhabitable, only to discover thriving ecosystems in deep-sea vents, acidic hot springs, and the dry valleys of Antarctica. We've underestimated the resilience of life again and again. Venus deserves to be investigated, not with the assumption that life is there, but with the recognition that it might be. Why does this matter? On a practical level, understanding Venus helps us understand Earth. The two planets started with similar conditions. They're made of the same materials. They orbit the same star. But somewhere in their history, they diverged. Earth remained habitable. Venus became a hellscape. If we can figure out why that happened, we can better predict the future of our own planet. Climate change on Earth is driven by increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Venus's atmosphere is almost entirely carbon dioxide. Studying Venus gives us a window into what happens when greenhouse warming goes unchecked. But on a deeper level, the question of life on Venus touches on something more fundamental: the nature of life itself. We've only ever studied one example of life on Earth. All living things here share a common ancestor. They all use DNA, RNA, and proteins. They all rely on water. They all follow the same basic biochemical pathways. Is that the only way life can work? Or are there other solutions, other chemistries, other solvents? If life exists on Venus, and if it's independent of Earth life, then it represents a second data point. It would show us that life is not a fluke, not a cosmic accident, but something that emerges naturally when conditions are right. It would suggest that life is common in the universe, not rare. And if life on Venus turns out to be related to Earth life, carried from one planet to another by meteorites, that would be remarkable in a different way. It would demonstrate that life can survive the journey through space, frozen in rock for millions of years, and then reanimate when it reaches a suitable environment. It would mean that the solar system, and perhaps the galaxy, is connected by a web of biological exchange. Either outcome would change how we think about our place in the universe. There is so much we still don't know about Venus. We don't know if it ever had liquid water on its surface. The isotopic ratios suggest it did, but the models disagree. Some simulations show Venus cooling enough for oceans to form. Others show it remaining too hot, with water staying as steam in the atmosphere until it was lost to space. We don't know how long Venus might have been habitable. Was it a few 100 million years? A billion years? 2 billion years? The answer matters, because the longer the habitable period, the more likely it is that life had time to arise and evolve. We don't know what the atmospheric composition was in the past. Did Venus have a nitrogen-rich atmosphere like Earth? Did it have oxygen? Methane? The noble gas isotopes might give us clues, but we haven't measured them yet. We don't know if Venus is volcanically active today. Recent observations suggest it might be, but we need more data to confirm. And we don't know how much volcanic outgassing contributes to the atmospheric chemistry. We don't know what the cloud particles are made of. Sulfuric acid, yes, but what else? Are there salts, metals, organics? The particles are too small to study with current instruments. We need better microscopes, better spectrometers, and we don't know if life is there. That's the biggest unknown of all. Here's what we know for certain. Venus is a planet with a thick atmosphere and a cloud layer that contains liquid droplets. The temperature and pressure in parts of that cloud layer are compatible with life as we understand it. The clouds show patterns that change over time, including absorption of ultraviolet light by an unknown substance, variations in opacity, and periodic fluctuations that might correlate with the atmospheric rotation. The atmosphere contains trace amounts of gases that don't fit equilibrium chemistry: phosphine, ammonia, possibly oxygen. These gases might be explained by volcanism or photochemistry, but the explanations aren't complete. Laboratory experiments have shown that some of the building blocks of life can survive in concentrated sulfuric acid. Terrestrial microorganisms exist that thrive in conditions almost as extreme as those in Venus's clouds. And we have missions planned that will probe the atmosphere in detail, searching for answers. That's the state of the science as it stands today, in January 2026. We might find life on Venus, we might not. But either way, we're going to learn something profound about how planets evolve, how atmospheres work, and how resilient life can be. The search for life on Venus is just beginning. For decades, Venus was overlooked. It was too hostile, too unpleasant, too different from what we thought a habitable world should look like. But we're learning to look beyond the surface, to think about habitability in new ways. Life doesn't need solid ground. It doesn't need oceans. It just needs energy, chemistry, and time. And Venus has all three. The clouds of Venus are moving. They're changing. They're absorbing light in ways we don't fully understand. Something is happening up there, 50 kilometers above the scorching surface, drifting on winds that circle the planet faster than the speed of sound. We don't know what it is yet, but we're watching. And soon, we'll have the tools to find out. For now, all we can do is look up at that bright point of light in the evening sky and wonder. Venus has kept its secrets for centuries, but the age of discovery is coming, and the answers, when they arrive, will be worth the wait.